Well, welcome, Jennifer. We are really
Thank you.
curious about your work and thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about your journey and how you've come to this whole world of activism and medical anthropology and some of your formative events along the way.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in a family that was very engaged with civil rights activism. So my parents were very engaged with civil rights activism and lived in a community where that was a primary value. So that was something that probably I just sort of had in my consciousness early. I was also raised in the Quaker religion, which has been associated with social activism over some time. So even when you're young in Quakerism, you're kind of taught about this concept of speaking truth to power, although we sometimes neglect to teach the children that there are consequences for that. But they nevertheless hear it and start thinking about it, I think, early on. And I spent some time overseas as an undergraduate, and that was really an eye opener for me in terms of um, alternative modes of knowing and different life ways, and kind of just an appreciation for how much diversity there is out there in terms of people, in terms of plants, in terms of animals, in terms of environments. So when I went to graduate school for anthropology, my primary mentor was a man named Alfonso Ortiz, who was a Tewa Indian from San Juan Pueblo in New Mexico. And I worked with him for a number of years. And he unfortunately passed away while we were working together. So my focus had been on Native American women's health. And I did need to take a pretty right turn when he, or left turn, if you will, when he passed away. He was such a great mentor, and I learned so much from him. But I think he was really giving access into some of the communities I needed to work with. So I then took a detour into the world of Ayurvedic medicine, which is from the Indian subcontinent. And I did my PhD dissertation research on integrative medicine and integrative healthcare in the United States as a social movement, and what it means for the professionalization of those healers. And so I did that partially working with people who are going to school to become Ayurvedic practitioners. And in that time, I became very fascinated with the system. So I took the clinical training myself, and I practiced as an Ayurvedic doctor and a yoga therapist and a registered herbalist. And I've done that for many years, about 25 years. And during that time, the understanding of health and well being in Ayurveda is that we are not separate from our environment, we're contiguous with our environment. And so it's a five-element system of medicine. And that means that everything that exists in nature, we are also comprised of. And there's a very detailed and sophisticated enumeration of the journey of consciousness to matter. So we have a lot of spiritual causality in Ayurveda that comes into play. The etiology of disease is that it begins first in the spiritual body, funnels into the psycho-emotional body, and then into the physical body. So by the time you have a physical symptom, you have had these precursors of psycho-emotional imbalance and spiritual imbalance. So I think that the reality of that healing science makes one constantly concerned with the state of the environment, because the state of the environment and the state of nature is constantly informing our own well-being, physiology, psycho-emotional health, and spiritual health. So I do all of those things, and then I did a postdoc in complex systems research. So I'm also a complex systems researcher, and one of the primary things I've focused on in that area is creating clinical trial designs that are appropriate for multimodal therapies that have multi-target kind of approaches. And
Mhm.
those are not going to be randomized double-blind controlled trials because they are very reductionist in their orientation. So when we apply a study design that is poorly fitted for the healing system in question, then we don't really get a very relevant result. So I have used complex systems to design appropriate studies for these these uh, these systems of healing science that have a more complex, dynamic approach to health and well-being.
Wow. Very cool.
Yeah, that's quite a journey.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
been quite a
very,
journey. Yeah.
very exciting. Yeah, and well, what about activism? I mean, what we've been experiencing over the last 6 months or so, a lot of people are starting to rethink activism. A lot of people are exhausted from the
Mm.
fight. And so there's, I think, some retrenchment going on and some
Mm.
reevaluation going on. Where do you come down with this?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to answer the question that's hanging in the air that you haven't asked me yet, which is what is it to be radically human? Because I think it's part of the answer to the question you have asked me. And so, from my perspective, being radically human is about relationship, and the very kind of pragmatic definition of spirituality I use in my own work is relationship with self, others, and the environment. And
Mm,
so I think we have a spiritual problem on our hands when we talk about the Earth poly crisis. It's really a spiritual problem. It's a breakdown of our understanding with ourself, others, and our environment. And so, as much as it is useful to do all kinds of activism, we also have to do a reorientation of self and values. And, how are we being in the world in a way that is creating something positive, something beneficial, that is informing the well-being of others. So I think that's very important. And what I know in healthcare settings, which is something that concerns me a lot, and a place where activism is sorely needed right now, is that people talk a lot about burnout, but the literature shows that burnout is preceded by moral injury, and moral
mm,
injury is preceded by institutional betrayal. So we have to talk about the ways that these institutions are betraying the providers that are trying to deliver healthcare to a population that's getting more and more burdened by chronic disease from stress, from the the vulnerabilities of a sort of lifestyle related to late capitalism. So I think all those things are really relevant when we talk about activism. It is community and it is the wider society, but it is also where are we in terms of relationship with self, others, and our environment.
mhm, mhm,
There's been some movement in the medical field for nurses and physicians to not only be concerned about this in their institutional setting, but to also organize and take action on the street, to participate in public demonstrations and to speak out at sort of, physicians, of course, and scientists have some special credibility among most people, or at least they should. And so they're speaking out to get attention. And I think it's all positive, but it seems to me that they're focusing on the activities of politics, but it's difficult to see any changes in most forms of medicine that reflect some of the issues you're discussing. I guess what I'm saying is that is it possible as a traditional medical practitioner to get involved in the concern about planetary heating and not at the same time sort of rethink what it is I'm doing as a practitioner?
Right. So I would say the short answer is no. I think that what's happening, what I see amongst healthcare practitioners, they are equally burdened by the system.
Of
It's
course.
the insurance industry and for-profit medicine that is so problematic. Most hospitals, most large physician practices are now owned by venture capital and private equity, and that has happened basically in the last dozen or so years. Venture capital and private equity also now own most veterinary hospitals, most dentists' practices. They're kind of becoming very octopus-like in their takeover of all sort of healing spaces, which is highly problematic because um, what happens is their return to investors becomes primary over outcomes, health outcomes, be that for patients, animals, whomever. So, so I think what I see happening in amongst medical practitioners, when you go to medical school, and I'm a PhD, not a medical doctor, but I've been faculty 3 different medical campuses. So I've worked with physicians quite a lot, and there's an indoctrination process.
Mhm.
You want to be a part of that community. You want to belong, and there's a kind of self-edit and self-silencing that goes on in those communities, because to speak up means to perhaps be stigmatized. And so I think there's a really big consciousness raising moment right now with healthcare providers who understand that not only are they under duress from these really avaricious systems, but also that these systems are responsible in many ways for planetary breakdown, not just in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but in terms of the framing of healthcare as a disease care system, not in terms of prevention, not in terms of creating avenues for addressing social symptoms that inform disease or social circumstances that inform disease. And they're starting to understand, if my patient doesn't have healthy food, if my patient doesn't have appropriate housing, if it's not going to matter what type of prescription I write them. So I think that it is there's a really blossoming, I guess I would say, amongst healthcare providers now in terms of consciousness raising and social awareness. Being out in the street, I think there's a form of solidarity that takes shape, and there is it provides an alternate sense of belonging. If one is going to be stigmatized for one's activism by the larger community, then this is a community where I can be myself as a healthcare provider and still belong. So I think it has a lot of value, actually.
Mm. Mm. What would a radically human medical system look like? Sort of like from the 30,000-foot level, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it would be healthcare instead of disease care. I
Mhm.
think I think I'll answer your question in parts. I'm going to look to the future first, because I think what we have now is a system that is in free fall. It is breaking down. The timeline for that, I think, is unknown, but I don't think it can be patched up and put back together and continue on the way it is. The techno-bureaucratic system of medicine that we have is very destructive in
Mhm.
so many ways, and it also is just non-functional. It doesn't work. You can't get an appointment with your provider for sometimes weeks or months. When you do see them, it's for 15 minutes. They can't actually create relationship within that short clinical encounter. They can't actually provide any type of lifestyle or nutritional advice within that in a clinical encounter. Were it even that biomedicine emphasize nutrition in any way, which it really doesn't. So I think we have to know first that the system as we have it is not functional, and I don't think it's going to be able to kind of crawl along in its current fashion. So moving forward in the future, I mean, there's 2 ways to think about it. I think one is, were everything to stay the same, what might we replace it with? But I think the 4 of us here talking know that things aren't going to stay the same, that we are in a post-growth kind of collapse scenario, sort of understanding of where we are with planetary health, and that we have got to, I think, be brave and clear-eyed in terms of understanding the circumstances that are going to be on our plate moving forward. So this could mean disruptions of the electrical grid. It could mean that communities are cut off from one another by natural disasters and extreme weather events. It could mean and it could mean food shortages, obviously supply chain disruptions. So all those things are very problematic for techno-bureaucratic biomedicine as we see it today. They're so reliant on machines and high technology and things that are going to perhaps become just less available. So I think the future of medicine is going to be local, and it's going to be based in knowledges that are more environmentally friendly, more nature-based. I think it's going to be interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary teams that are more community-centered, and that work from the ground up, making sure that the environment is as healthy as possible to create a preventive kind of atmosphere. So that's what I would sort of say for starters.
Wow. Thank you.
Nice. Well, I'm reminded of I used to be a massage therapist. I still
Oh.
work with my friends a little bit. But when I was in massage school, they put a lot of emphasis on what they called scope of practice. And this was a huge subject that we talked about for weeks. And it was a legal definition. You are allowed to do this, but not this. And woe to anybody who goes outside their scope of practice. And what I anticipate, what I see is those boundaries are going to start to break down. I mean, how big is the scope of practice? How narrow is it? And I think practitioners now are going to have to confront those boundaries because they're too narrow. They're too narrow most of the time. I'm sure
I mean, it's,
yeah.
well, it's an interesting topic because scope of practice is something that is considered very sacred within the biomedical traditions, but the biomedical traditions have no problem whatsoever stepping on other healing sciences scopes of practice. It happens all the time. So they have no compunction in that regard. So that has become a primary issue for a lot of the more holistic systems of medicine, is this kind of extractive co-optation kind of transactional relationship with the other healing sciences, where they will say at a medical school, say, oh, we're gonna give 150 hours of Ayurvedic medicine and allow our MDs to practice within that paradigm. Well, an Ayurvedic doctor has about 4,000 hours of training. So so that person doesn't know anything about Ayurvedic medicine. They've gotten maybe just the most superficial slice, and it's in some ways dangerous, right, to allow people to engage in a scope of practice that in fact they are not properly trained in. So I just want to make that point because it's unfortunately not a two-way street, right? The scope of practice, the kind of sacredness, is very heavy in the biomedical world. They are very cautious, even within amongst themselves. Like medical doctors are very touchy about physician assistants or associates infringing on their scope. There's a lot of territoriality. And so I think that is, in some ways, as you say, Frank, maybe a thing of the past, because will there be time for all this kind of, status oriented competition as things begin to come apart? I'm not sure that will be the right path moving forward. So I do think that there will be, maybe when we think of an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary team, I mean, I think sort of Venn diagram, there will be areas of overlap, right? And that will be necessary because who knows who will be the components or composition of your team of providers. So, but I think even in the interdisciplinary team in the clinic where I work, I mean, we have medical doctor, physician assistant, traditional Chinese medicine, naturopaths. But it's sort of like, what is best for the patient? That's really the definition of integrative healthcare, is whatever practitioners, paradigms, and practices will achieve the best outcome for the patient. So it's really about that humility, that kind of epistemic humility in terms of, it's not about me as the provider, it's about how do we work together to produce the best outcome for this patient. And I think moving forward, I'm that's what I would love to see, is that the kind of, I would say, surrendering of professional kind of territoriality to something that is far more collaborative.
It does seem also that the very purpose of licensure limitations is to some extent just to enforce the existing bureaucratic hierarchy. I mean, you have the physician at the top, then the family nurse practitioner or physician's assistant. Then in California, it's a registered nurse. Then it's a licensed vocational nurse. And a lot of this is just to keep the structure consistent, to keep the insurance companies happy, and to structure things in a manner that can be managed by non-professionals. I mean, essentially, you can bring in somebody that doesn't know anything about healthcare, and they can start to try to tinker with the system, looking perhaps at profit or some other motivation instead of the overall care delivered to the patient. So it would seem to me, if there is a significant breakdown, a lot of that's going to break down too.
Yeah, I probably will. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that I'm not, I'm completely um, divorced from the value of some amount of regulation, credentialing,
Right.
accreditation. So I've been involved with those efforts for Ayurvedic medicine, for yoga therapy, creating scopes of practice, curricular guidelines, competencies, hourly requirements. So, we do need to have some benchmarks for
Mhm.
what makes a well-trained practitioner. But at the same time, I think it's useful to understand that, yes, these are also industries. They make a lot of money and they
Mhm.
create a lot of, there's that word again, techno-bureaucratic, right? A lot of bureaucracy
Right.
that requires a lot of expensive infrastructures to maintain. And so I think, there's certainly opportunities for streamlining, for optimization, for breaking down of kind of disciplinary boundaries. I think in a really sort of more general sense, we're moving into a transdisciplinary world because our problems are transdisciplinary. And
Mhm.
so even in healthcare, can we think about optimal treatment approaches and outcomes that are transdisciplinary in nature so that we center the patient and their needs?
Can
Mhm.
you comment on the, how should I put it, the proper way to merge or to organize or to consider what are now somewhat distinctive fields between what they call, quote, healthcare,
Mhm.
physical versus mental health care. I mean, it seems that sometimes and often the two issues are closer related than the way they're being treated in a traditional medical system.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. Well, in any of the holistic medical sciences or healthcare sciences, we speak about the mind body paradigm. So in
Right.
fact, there isn't that separation, right? There's this continuity that is always present. And so when you have a patient that comes with either a psycho-emotional symptom or a physiological symptom, you're going to investigate the other, the one that is not necessarily presenting as primary. Because in terms of causality, we know that there's not that artificial separation that has kind of been put forward as if it were sort of the scientific notion. It's in actual reality and in the human body and the human experience, it doesn't happen that way. So, from the perspective of the holistic medical sciences, we always treat the patient's physiology and their psycho-emotional health together.
Mhm.
The one thing for me that was really promising was to see this book by Bessel van der Kolk. I'm sure you've read
Mm-hmm,
into that, When the Body Keeps Score, and he
mm-hmm,
advocates for these somatic
Mhm.
approaches to mental illness. And that's become widely accepted now. I think a lot more people are using that as a starting place. We're going to start with the
Mhm.
body to heal the mind, and it's becoming almost mainstream.
mm-hmm.
Mhm.
No, and I think it's wonderful. I mean, somatic approaches are really important. I think one of the things that is happening more and more, which I very much support, is the normalization of trauma. We all have trauma.
Mhm.
Trauma is not for just for veterans or sexual assault survivors. It's really, especially in this moment of planetary crisis, and we have eco anxiety and we have eco grief. I mean, everybody is really in, and we have social breakdown, and we have the rise of fascism, and not just here but across the world. And so I think it's really important to recognize that trauma is very normal. And what I like to say is it's not a competition, right? We don't have to think my trauma is this way or your trauma is that way, just to recognize that everyone is experiencing it differently, but that yes, it's both a mind and body phenomenon.
Mhm.
And so Bessel van der Kolk, I mean, has done great work to just identify that the trauma situates itself in places in the body. It's going to be different for each person, but sometimes when the challenge of accessing that from a talk therapy or more of a kind of an analytical conceptual perspective is less available, we can use the body to find
Mhm.
the places where trauma has lodged itself, and we can sort of coax it out into a place where it can be metabolized and processed and eliminated. So I think it's a very, very valuable perspective. And as a yoga therapist, I mean, I'm right there. There are a lot of really fabulous yoga therapy approaches for all types of not just physical conditions, but psycho-emotional conditions, and including trauma.
Mm. Yeah, fascinating, John.
I noticed on looking at your website that it was interesting. You used the term not physician patient, but more physician educator patient student. And it seemed perhaps subtle, but a really important distinction. Can you sort of expand on that and, describe your perspective in that regard?
Sure. I mean, the thing about Ayurvedic medicine as a healing science is that there's a lot of self-care that's built in,
Mhm.
both in terms of treatment and in terms of prevention. So it's not, people I think of self-care as prevention, but within Ayurvedic medicine, self-care can also be treatment. And so
Mhm.
it's not a dependency provoking healing paradigm. And I don't mean that in a negative way per se, and we do a lot of hands-on and manual therapies, but it's not the kind of paradigm where the patient feels, oh, if I don't have my provider, I don't know what to do. Because part of
Right.
our job as Ayurvedic providers is to educate them. This is your constitution. This is your imbalance. This is why you're manifesting the symptoms you are manifesting. Here are the root causes. When you understand the root causes, here are the foods you can avoid, the types of relationships you want to pursue, the type of relationship. Here are the meditation and mantra and spiritual practices you can do to bolster and strengthen your relationship with self, which is going to reduce psycho-emotional symptoms, and help with your spiritual orientation in life. And so there's a lot of self-care that is built in, and there's a lot of self-understanding, which is considered pivotal and foundational for the patient's journey, you know. And of course, we also treat acute conditions, and sometimes you're just going to say, take this herbal remedy and avoid these activities and come back and see me. And that's a little bit simpler, but it's never going to end there. That is, the patient is going to, by virtue of accessing Ayurveda, have a sense of ownership
Mhm.
over
Mhm.
their health and well-being that is often, less present in certain paradigms. And it's very sort of magical in a way, sort of astonishing, the shifts and changes that you can see in people when you give them, appropriate and powerful tools for their own self-care, their own health promotion, and their own psycho-emotional well-being.
One of the things that Frank and John and John is really the driver on this, and I've been talking about is the idea of a parallel polis, meaning a society separate from, in a sense, and a movement separate from what's been hacked in Western extractivist capitalist systems. There's a lot more to it, but suffice to say, the whole point is to move agency back to the individual, but that requires awareness, right? And
Mm.
in a small group. So in westernized medicine, it seems like the whole shift has been away from personal agency and into this dependency system. And then now with the insurance companies, they're saying they're like the Deus ex machina. They're the God that decides whether the physician who could maybe do something for you is allowed to do something for you. It's really quite incredible how horrible it's become. And I'm wondering if what you've been talking about represents in a contiguous, radically human way, the ability to regain ownership over self and agency over self, but also recognizing that on the spiritual, the psychological, and the physical, that we exist in this series of whole systems, and educating
Mm-hmm.
people on that, and then the impacts of that might help us become both more radically human, express ourselves in a higher self way, be able to connect into other medical ways of living or non-medical ways of living that are healthy, and change society that way.
100%. So, I mean, one of the things I like to talk about and kind of cue people into is that systems way of thinking was not invented in the West in the 1920s. It stems from traditional world medicines and indigenous ways of knowing. All of the systems, concepts, ideas, and understandings are there in traditional ecological knowledge and in understandings of traditional world medicine and indigenous healing. They're all there already. So part of my, my scholarship and the articles that I've published, speak on this subject, that some of the language of systems thinking is very useful to kind of portray and translate the innate, complex, dynamic, nonlinear ideas that were embedded into traditional ways of healing and traditional ecological knowledge, many, many thousands of years ago, but that have, it's sort of ancient wisdom redux. People think that this is new, and this is not new. And so I'd like to draw those kinds of connections for people, because I think that referencing those paradigms and those understandings, they exist in full and complete form, and they encompass all living beings, right? It's a kin-centric worldview where in the environment, us, plants, animals, we are all relations, right? And to understand ourselves in that way is so transformative. It's almost, it's difficult to describe the level of transformation that can happen when people can actually plug into this kind of mentality. And it is life-giving, it is life-sustaining, and it is something that allows us to move forward with purpose in a way that isn't about, toxic individuality, right? And the kind of notion that, oh, what am I getting out of this life? That's not the question anymore. And I think part of what you referenced is, the healing relationship is a sacred relationship. And this interference of capitalism and of the insurance industry in the provider-patient relationship is so destructive to people's understanding of what it means to be well, and what it means to connect, and what it means to belong, and what it means to be alive. So I think that when we can reference these very full, complete, sophisticated, nuanced, intricate paradigms of health and healing that have existed for thousands of years, it actually gives us something back that we didn't know we were missing.
Nice.
Well, one thing that I have been finding really interesting recently is the pushback against psychiatry, biomedical psychiatry, and especially the DSM. Because a lot of people are saying, look, there's nothing wrong with my brain. There is nothing wrong with my biochemistry and my neurotransmitter levels. I'm living in a context that is driving a certain response in my body. And that's what's happening. And so they're pushing back really hard now. And I feel like we're getting close to some sort of revolution in that domain.
Yeah, I mean, I think that nervous system regulation is the key to everything, right? In Ayurvedic medicine, we're always thinking about nervous system regulation as a foundation for health and well-being. And so the world that we live in is, constantly working against a healthful and balanced nervous system regulation. And sometimes when I'll just use myself as an example. When I talk with patients, they come in saying, I have this physiological symptom, and I end up talking to them about their job or, family stressors, things that they didn't think they were going to talk to me about, because that's not how Western biomedicine would approach the problem. But I look specifically for those items and issues that are nervous system dysregulators and try to address those, because that's the root cause, right? That's root cause for a lot of people. So I'm not going to give them a different diet or a different, herbal remedy, or prescribe them certain therapeutic yoga poses and not address those things that are in a constant pattern of disrupting their nervous system. That would be poor medicine on my part.
Well, what would be the, how should I put it, the most effective approach? Say that someone comes in and says, I'm really under a lot of stress at my job. I've had this job for 10 years. I understand that they're going to close down where I work because somebody bought the company, and I'm going to be out of work, and I just separated from my husband, and I've got two kids, and I'm worried about child support.
Mhm.
I mean, in a perhaps a traditional setting, they'd be say, well, you're under a lot of stress, and here's some medication
Mhm.
to relieve your stress. What alternatives how would the analysis differ, and what alternatives would be provided uh, given your approach?
Right.
I know it's a little
So
hypothetical, but
hypothetical, yeah. So I'll answer you first by saying it's not what disease does the person have, but which person has the disease. So we have to understand who is this person in terms of their original constitution, in terms of their current imbalance, and how is that imbalance being expressed through the tissues and channels of the body. And so we want to, I mean, in Ayurvedic, I don't want to go into too much detail about Ayurvedic science because it's quite complicated, but we want to pacify the doshas. That's the way we always address treatment, right? But that means an absolute multitude of things, right? So in that person's case, they have a lot of circumstantial stressors. So, and given that it may take some time to resolve some of those circumstantial stressors, I might look at their, what symptoms are they experiencing? Do they have joint pain? Do they have, acid reflux? Do they have constipation? So, what are the issues that, aside from just we know that stress is there, right?
right,
Are there other things? So, one thing I always like to kind of note is that a person whose nervous system, excuse me, is on fire is not going to be able to make behavioral changes, right? So you've got to calm the nervous system as best you can, and you've got to make reasonable requests of the body. So I might say to the person, well, I see that there's a pattern of inflammation here. Here are the ways we're going to change your diet. I might say to them, your nervous system is extremely, energized and aggravated right now in a way that's, let's say, disrupting your sleep. I'm going to give you some breathing exercises and simple stretching before bed. I might say, here's an herbal remedy that is targeted to reduce the aggravation of your nervous system. I might also say, maybe it's useful for you to have some talk therapy about the breakdown of your marriage. So I'm going to start to also pull in other providers that I think would be useful to this person, because the way that integrative healthcare works is that it's collaborative. So I do a certain amount of psycho-spiritual counseling, but if a person needs regularly weekly talk therapy or can benefit from that, then I pull in a colleague, right? And I say, here's something that may be of value to you. If the person is having panic attacks on a daily basis that are debilitating, I may say, let's think about a short term, maybe very low dose of some pharmaceutical. So there are times if a person is having a debilitating kind of scenario where their life is completely upended, there may be the appropriate use of that, right? So that's part of the collaborative and referral sort of network that is used. I think pharmaceuticals are overused, but that is not to say that they don't have their place in certain circumstances. They do. They are powerful substances that can be very meaningful at times, but just I think conservatively and with caution. So, but that is, something that is not taught in medical schools. If I had my way, like if I was sort of, queen for the day, I would say, okay, well, we're going to have a course in medical schools fully on referral, on referring out. Because as you were stating earlier, Frank, the notion of scope of practice for a Western biomedical physician, they really think the entirety of the universe is within their scope of practice. But in fact, there are providers much more well-trained and much more appropriate and effective under certain circumstances and conditions, and to achieve certain patient outcomes. So I just think it would be revolutionary to have a course on referral within the biomedical curriculum, because most biomedical providers don't know what other healthcare providers do, what other healing sciences have to offer, and they're very nervous and somewhat fearful about developing relationships with other kinds of providers, or referring out even when it might really benefit their patient, even when they're outside of their own depth, and are feeling a bit de-skilled in terms of what's in front of them. So that's an area that I think, is a deficit in the traditional biomedical school curriculum.
Mm. It seems like that those 150 hours that you spoke about that the medical schools giving them for Ayurvedic, saying, "Oh, here you go, you got all of it," would be better spent on 150 hours of learning about other disciplines and other ways
Mm-hmm.
of healing and how to get referrals and how to give referrals and all that. And it seems that the block on that is partially the insurance companies because they want to keep everything in network, in practice. Very simply, here's our checklist of what's allowable and what's not. And if it doesn't fit here, it's not medicine.
Absolutely. It's about profit, in the final analysis. And if you have systems of healing that are focused on prevention, you don't make money off of healthy patients. You
Right.
just don't. So that's not very attractive in that way. And I mean, we do have great medical schools and educational curricula on integrative healthcare and integrative medicine. We've got master's degrees that often students will take before they go to medical school. We have master's degrees for students, for practicing professionals to take, oftentimes when they realize, oh, there are things I would like to provide my patient with, and I don't have the training. So those curricula and degree programs are out there. But I think that the way the medical system is going, they're sort of under threat. And the I think very problematic thing that you're referencing in terms of insurance reimbursement is that most of these healthcare paradigms that are not biomedical or in their orientation are not covered by medicine. So it creates a giant equity and access issue. Everyone should have access to all healing paradigms that would give them the most beneficial outcome. And in the medical reimbursement system that we have now, it's really people with some kind of disposable income that have access to a lot of these systems because they're the ones that are able to pay out of pocket. And I think it's just in the way that, when we go looking for healthy food and we realize that our local farmer maybe also is a low income person because farmers don't make a lot of money. So it's kind of, if we can, engage with a community supported agriculture and we can exchange money with somebody in our community who is also not a person of wealth, but a person providing a service who is maybe somewhere in that low to moderate income range, that's something that uplifts the whole community. And likewise, it happens in these systems of integrative healthcare that a lot of providers with an enormous amount of training, be they naturopaths, traditional Chinese medicine, massage therapy, acupuncture, herbalists, Ayurvedic medicine providers, these are also people who are constantly asked to work for free in a biomedical environment. Oh, why don't you volunteer? You're sort of invited to breathe the rarefied air, and that's supposed to be enough. So I think it's kind of, it's an important understanding for people to have that, being that there isn't insurance reimbursement, and so many of these providers are service oriented and would love to treat a full spectrum of patients, including, people on Medicaid, people who have fallen through the insurance gap, who just are uninsured, all the people that are really bearing undue burden of chronic disease and who have lifestyle related conditions due to stress, due to circumstances that come with being less resourced or under resourced. It's a situation again where some of the providers fall into that category because they're not able to use the infrastructure of insurance reimbursement. So we've got to find a way to connect these populations with well-trained providers who are not able to use insurance reimbursement and patients that really are maybe on the lower access and equity spectrum, and make sure that we can uplift both those populations simultaneously.
Wow.
One of the questions we always ask our guests has to do with young people and what kind of advice that we, as you might say, tribal elders, have for young people coming up now. Is what kind of professions are promising? What kind of attitude? What kind of activism should young people engage in now? And it's not altogether clear to us what kind of advice to be given out at this moment in time. What do you think about that?
Well, I do a lot of listening, honestly. I'm sort of a little bit right now for youngering instead of eldering. I think eldering still has value, but it's just like with anything, if the power structure has been such for a while that a group of people have been the talkers instead of the listeners, sometimes it's good to turn that on its head and see what happens when we become more receptive and more of a container instead of a transmitter. So, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what I would say, except that I'm here to work with you and help me to understand your life experience, your worldview, the things that matter to you. And I'm happy to share mine with you as well. And let's collaborate and let's work together and let's try to create a level playing field so that everyone feels included, everyone feels energized, everyone feels inspired. And yeah, I think breaking down boundaries of all kinds is very beneficial right now. So even those boundaries between eldering and youngering, I think would benefit from a little bit of breakdown.
And what, go ahead, John.
Go ahead, Frank.
Oh, well, we always ask also about trajectory and what your future plans are, where you're going with your work and your knowledge, and what kind of projects you have coming up in, say, the coming year.
Right.
Well, so one of the things that's very near and dear to my heart right now is working on a curriculum or curricula that really foreground traditional world medicines, indigenous healing sciences, and traditional ecological knowledge as the foundational um, values, precepts, ideas, and understandings for planetary health.
Mm.
What I see in this arena happening at the moment is a sprinkling like salt and pepper of indigenous concepts, sort of over around the top for flavor or window dressing. And I think that is disrespectful and potentially destructive. And so I work with a small group of traditional indigenous medicine practitioners of all kinds. Some of them are from indigenous communities, but some of us are just practitioners who've been engaged with these systems for a long period of time, and to work on those curricula and to try to make sure that those values and concepts and ideas are foregrounded and foundational instead of supplemental, superficial, kind of referenced. What I would like to see is that indigenous healing science practitioners and traditional ecological knowledge holders are not just invited to the table in ones or twos, but in multiplicity, in large numbers. They're given the authority to make decisions, and their voices are really amplified and centered rather than kind of, you know, one or two at a time, sort of to cast an aura rather than to really be instrumental and be integrated and be primary. So that's something that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm working on that. And anything that's related to kind of a post-growth scenario. I mean, understanding that various features of collapse may be on the horizon, I don't think has to be a negative, in the sense that if we use it as fuel for transformation, then it becomes opportunity and it becomes a way to build stronger communities, more inclusive communities, communities with better understanding, better orientation, better resourcing, better mutual aid. So I feel like those conversations are really important to conduct with kind of a lens of what's joyful here, you know, not what is really dark here. Let's be practical, but let's see, what about this breakdown? Where are there opportunities for joy and for connection and for the result to be, the end to be a bit better than the beginning, basically.
That's inspirational.
Yes, it is.
Yes, because I think we're all vulnerable to bouts of hopelessness and despair and related, feelings. How do you cope with that kind of thing? Surely you must have days.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, living so close to the seat of governmental power right now at this time is very confronting, very challenging. Um, but I think, and it can lead to alienation, it can lead to despair, and it can lead to people feeling so challenged that then they may isolate. And so I think it's so necessary for us um, to have what I call, back pocket skills to bring out for self-regulation, for the promotion of connection, for storing ourselves up psycho-emotionally so that we are resourced enough to be resilient in those times, and resourced enough to be able to take that deep breath, to recognize that though there is crisis, we are still alive. We are still able to make decisions. We still have agency. We're still able to be in relationship. We're still able to connect with nature in a way that nourishes us. And all of those small things, I mean, it can be taking a walk, it can be connecting with an animal, it can be taking those 6 deep cleansing breaths, it can be calling someone that you love, it can be just literally sitting on the ground next to a tree and saying, what do you have to tell me? So there are so many possibilities, and I think just using these pocket practices, or feeling resourced enough that in the moment, instead of feeling overwhelmed, we can say, I can think of one thing that might assist me here.
Mm. Mm.
That's wonderful.
I love that. It's a series of default pocket practices that you can just pull out and use for self and also in a group situation at any time.
Mm-hmm.
What would the world look like if we start teaching 5-year-olds that?
Yeah.
A little more powerful than maybe the folks in DC want.
Yeah, I mean, imagine, kids are learning more about their nervous systems these days, and they are, a lot of them, depending on kind of, what settings they're growing up in or being educated in, but they're, quite intuitive. And I think that's another key feature, is that we have to sometimes find enough quiet to listen to the still small voice within, and to take what's there for us in terms of our intuition. And teaching that to children, letting them know that they are resourced, that they have within them certain strength, certain resilience, and certain knowing. Even if they may be 5, they have a knowing within them, and they can listen to that, and they can have regard for it, they can respect it, and they can act on it. And I think, I mean, I have children, and they're older, they're sort of young adults, but I see in them that they are more resourced than I was at their age. They're more aware. They have understandings of certain really powerful concepts about well-being, about psycho-emotional health, about relationship, and they know instinctively that the way things are is not the way things should be.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
True.
Powerful.
Wonderful. Well, we're coming up on our time here. Do you guys have any further questions or ideas?
No, I was grateful to hear the plans for the future. I think it's a very interesting and important approach.
Mm. Yeah, I think we could probably all come up with another 2 or 3 dozen questions the deeper we go into your work. So really thankful for your time today.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Absolutely. It was
Yeah,
lovely talking with you all.
yeah, this is very exciting, and yeah, it'd be great if we could extend this conversation, and if you'd like to join us in some way, maybe we could team up and invite other people on and have these conversations going forward. So yeah, I would just like to put out that invitation. And
Absolutely. I can think of half a dozen people right now off the top of my head that I think would be great to bring into this circle and share their wisdom. I think it'd be fabulous.
Yeah, that would be very helpful to us, and I
yeah,
think to our viewers.
yeah, yeah.